today, and I am a community advisor with the Texas After Violence Project. I am here with Samantha Benavides, Lovinah Igbani-Perkins, and Jennifer Toon, three amazing activists who are a part of TAVP's Sheltering Justice Project. And in case anyone in our audience is not already aware, Sheltering Justice is a documentation and archival initiative to responsibly and ethically document, preserve, and share the stories of people who are directly and disproportionately impacted by the intersection of COVID-19 and mass incarceration. And so that will be the topic of our panel this evening. And before I get started with asking our panelists questions, I think that introductions are a great way to get things going. So if everyone could please share their names, pronouns, and then what brings them to the panel, that would be excellent. And I'm happy to get started. So as I mentioned, my name is Susannah Bannon. My pronouns are she, they, and I am a formerly incarcerated activist, educator, and researcher, having recently graduated from the University of Texas with my PhD in communication studies. I also serve as a community advisor with the Texas After Violence Project. I am also a co-founder of the formerly incarcerated College Graduates Network, and I serve on the advisory board for the Philosophy and Literature Circle, a prison education program based out of Trinity University and the University of Texas at San Antonio. I will also be serving as the moderator this evening. So I would like to popcorn it to my fellow community advisor, Jennifer Toon, to introduce herself.
Thank you, Susie. It's hard to follow after you. My name is Jennifer Toon, pronouns she and her. I am also a community advisor here at TAVP. I am too formerly incarcerated, having done almost 19 years in the Texas Youth Commission and the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. And when I got out, I knew exactly my mission and my purpose in life was to be a voice for those who I left on the inside, whether it's working on mental health policies, which I do at the Coalition of Texans with Disabilities, or acting as a community advisor here to make sure that those marginalized voices that we often don't hear from, such as women and people with disabilities, that their voices are heard within the criminal justice system. I'm also a freelance writer. I've published in the Texas Observer and the Guardian, and also the Tyler Loop, which gave me my first start. So I wanted to give a special shout out to them, a very progressive publication in Tyler, Texas, in Deep East Texas. So I'm excited to be here, and I look forward to the discussion. And I can pop it on over to Lavina.
Awesome. Thank you, Jennifer. My name is Lovinah Igbani-Perkins. I am also formerly incarcerated. I got home about a little over 7 years ago. And since being home, I started about a year after I got out, I started doing a lot of volunteer work, volunteering inside of prisons for a little over 5 years until COVID happened. And when COVID happened, I shifted to more advocating, and that's what I started doing, and started putting together rallies in Austin. So I'm working full-time as a licensed chemical dependency counselor, and just completed my bachelor in social work, and I'm currently in a master's of social work program scheduled to graduate in May. And that's about it. I'll pass it on.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sam Benavides. My pronouns are she, hers. And right now, I'm 22 years old. I'm from Laredo, Texas. It's a border town. And I live in San Marcos now. I moved here about 3 years ago. I just graduated from Texas State with a bachelor's in public administration and political communication this past May. And I'm now working, and I've been working with Mano Amiga, which is a criminal justice reform nonprofit based in Hays County, but we also do work in Guadalupe. And I feel like what brings me close to the work, so I met them through doing coalition work with another nonprofit that I used to work for called Move Texas. I was their advocacy intern and then fellow. And so I was pushing with Mano Amiga passed the cite and release ordinance in San Marcos to keep people out of the legal system for petty offenses. And I feel like what really makes me feel close to the work that I do, so everyone on Mano Amiga is either directly or indirectly impacted. So they've either been through the legal system themselves or have been impacted by that of a loved one, such as myself. So my dad, growing up, he was pretty much, in and out of the legal system pretty much my whole life for all sorts of offenses. And he also had a lot of friends who were houseless. And so a lot of them lived with us from time to time, and they were like uncles to me. And so I feel like I have a different perspective than a lot of people, having grown up with people like that from a very young age. And so I feel like that's what makes me feel really close to the work that I do. And I'm excited to hear what everyone else has to say this evening.
Thank you so much for those wonderful introductions. As mentioned, Sheltering Justice is all about stories. So folks are interviewed, they share their stories, those stories are preserved and then shared for other people to learn about the experiences of folks affected by COVID-19 and mass incarceration. So I want to ask the panel first and foremost, when you were participating in Sheltering Justice, what was that experience like in sharing your story? What did you feel as you were telling someone about these very personal experiences that you had?
Wow. When I was interviewed, I was super nervous. I don't know why, but I was really nervous. And I think a big part of it was that I didn't, I can tend to be emotional sometimes, and I didn't want my emotions to take over. And it's something that's so passionate, because not only was I there, I also have a loved one who's still incarcerated. And during that time, COVID was really it was bad. It wasn't getting bad. It was bad. And people were messaging me almost weekly, telling me that their loved one had died. And so emotionally, my emotions behind it were so strong. I'm just so passionate about the changes that I felt needed to be made. However, during the interview, the person who interviewed me, Murphy, it was just she had a really calming effect. When I did become emotional, she was with me in my feelings, and that really helped me to be able to move forward throughout the interview. And I knew that at the end of the day, there was some information that I needed to get out. So I was able to share the pertinent details that I really wanted to get out. And it was a great interview.
I love that you said that about emotions, right? Because when I did my interview, I was, on fire and passionate to share what was happening to the women in Gatesville. And when I refer to Gatesville, I mean the group that's where predominantly the women in Texas are incarcerated. And so we had just had a friend of ours, an older lady named Annie, Granny Ann, and she had just passed away, and I believe she was the first female to pass away of COVID. And she had been at Mountain View for many years. So I was ready to tell that story, and I was ready to share what the girls were telling me. I was so angry and outraged because I too had been incarcerated when, certainly a pandemic didn't happen, but we had outbreaks of other things. So I knew what they were feeling. And so when Murphy got into the interview with me, I did not expect to be so emotional. Like I felt, it felt like a deeply intimate, personal conversation with someone who represented an organization that really cared about my narrative and the women who were locked up, their narrative. Like just really holding that space of being able to, because journalists have a way of interviewing that's like, I need this information. And you can connect to a journalist. I mean, I've done some interviewing, and it's a different type of style to just get the meat of the information. And this is a different type of interviewing that really captures the emotion and the experience. So for me, it was like, I didn't expect my emotions to really come out like that. And I'm really proud of that interview, because sometimes prison kind of deadens that or makes that numb. When difficult situations arise, you kind of lose touch with your emotions because you're just being practical about something. So that's what I noticed right away, as the interview progressed and then towards the end.
Yeah, for me, at the time, so I do a lot of communications work with Mano Amiga, and at the time, I wasn't too familiar with Texas After Violence Project, and so when my boss said that we were having an interview, I kind of thought that it was a media interview, and I didn't really know what we were covering, and then I realized, in participating in the interview, that we were just talking about, our experiences, and it was a lot more. I don't think casual is the word, but I just felt a lot more comfortable. And I think I did it with Amy Camp, and I can't remember the other person's name that was recording, but yeah, it was really nice to talk about my dad and his friends and know that those stories are, relevant and important, and that people care to hear those stories meant a lot to me. That those stories mean a lot to other people. And it also helped that I did the interview with Eric Martinez, who is our policy director at Mano Amiga. So it was the two of us both sharing our experiences. He also is indirectly impacted through a loved one, his stepfather. And so he was talking about his upbringing with his stepfather and his experience, and I talked about mine. So I think it was really helpful to have us both talking about our experiences that are somewhat similar. So I think it was a really great experience.
And I just want to remind our audience that we are open for questions. So feel free to drop a question in the chat or in the comments, and we'll be sure to answer them for you. As a follow-up question, you have spoken a bit about advocacy work prior to Sheltering Justice. And I was curious as to how does the work that Sheltering Justice does, how is that different from the advocacy work that you had already been doing?
That's for me.
That's for anyone.
Okay, for anyone. Okay, so I think it's definitely a big difference because my experience with advocating has mainly been helping to organize functions, the rallies and whatnot, and be on the outside that face going to the Capitol, making noise, pushing the, email your representatives and that kind of thing. Whereas the work that the Texas After Violence Project does really puts a face to everything and to the stories. And when you go through the archives, you really, it's like reality, and not that that isn't reality, but it's different. You're reading a lot of firsthand experiences, which is not what I was doing at all. I was speaking for the voiceless, whereas these are the very people that and there's their stories told. So that really is a different level of, and it brings awareness. Like, hey, I'm a person. This is what's going on, and this is a great need that is a lot of the public don't know about.
I think for me, I was just getting into advocacy work and into these spaces. And I think like Lavina, it was a lot of organizing and a lot of, okay, well, coalition work and what do we need to do next? What do we need to tell TDCJ, the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, and just doing things like that. And I felt like after having done the interview with Sheltering Justice and looking through TAVP's work, this is very much what I believe advocacy really is. And that is storytelling, oral history. And this was my first session working as an advocate. And I noticed that legislators, while they enjoy data, they like to have, data and academic information. It's the personal stories of the people that are impacted. And it doesn't matter what arena we're talking about, whether it's criminal justice or healthcare or education. It's the stories of the people that it affects most. that are the most impactful. And so I feel like this is the heart of advocacy, really, is narrative.
Mm-hmm. That's so true, Jennifer. I just want to add that is the reason why it's so vital that when we do have the opportunity once every 2 years to get before legislators during a legislative session, it's important that everyone, all family, everyone gets down to, to Austin, to the Capitol, to give testimony about the things that are concerning them, because it puts a face to it. It's not just something that they are reading about or may hear. It really it's like in their faces now. And these are the people that are going to be making the decisions, and putting in the laws, or, sending laws to Senate. And so, yeah.
Yeah, one thing that I think is so beautiful about the work that Texas After Violence does is, so Mano Omega also tries to be very intentional about putting the voices of directly impacted people at the forefront of our advocacy efforts. Because I agree, legislators, they love data, but hearing testimonies from people who have been through the system is so much more powerful, in my opinion. And so one thing that I love about Texas After Violence is that while we try to center those voices, we will connect with people who have been directly impacted and then connect them with journalists. And so they're able to tell their story, but ultimately it's the journalist who's writing the story and reporting on the story. And there's only, a snippet that they can include. Whereas Texas After Violence, I think our interview went on for like 2 hours, and you're able to really go into detail and they hear the entirety of it and the way that you want to tell it. And so I think that's the beauty of it, because we have to kind of prepare people beforehand and kind of go over talking points and exactly what I feel like with, especially with TV journalism, you have to have just like short snippets that you want them to include, and you want to keep repeating that to make sure that that gets included, because there's only so much time that you have. But yeah, it's also something that we try to do, just centering their voices. We have one gentleman, Joe Negrete, who had been arrested on a citation eligible offense at the beginning of the pandemic. And so in our push for Cite and Divert, which would keep people out of the legal system for certain low-level offenses that the Texas state legislature already allows officers to issue citations for. And with Cite and Divert, you would do a either community service or pay restitution or an educational course, and then the charges never put on your record to begin with. So that's something that we were pushing for. And Joe Negrete would show up to our protests and connect with journalists to share his story. And he's also working with us to, we just kicked off our campaign to decriminalize cannabis in San Marcos, and that's what he was arrested for, possession. And there was one story that a journalist had shared and ended, I think the last point was he talked about Joe smoking and said he hopes voters, so we're doing it via ballot initiative, and he said he hopes voters will give him the chance to do it in public. For now, he will continue smoking and hopes that voters will allow him the chance to do it in public. And we were like, that is just such a weird way to end it. Weird and wrong. So yeah, that's all just to say it's so much better to have them tell the story themselves than to share it with the journalist and then have the journalists write it their way.
Yeah, and I want to keep talking about the importance of stories. And it sounds like all of you have, even prior to Sheltering Justice, you have engaged with people directly impacted by the carceral system. And you've done a lot of engagement with their stories, with them sharing these very deep and personal experiences with you. And so I am curious as to how do you approach these difficult conversations when these personal experiences are very raw and deeply affect people. What is your strategy for approaching those situations?
Let me see if this answers this. So are you saying like when people share these stories with us personally as advocates? Okay. So, especially when the pandemic started, I registered my phone to every female unit in the state of Texas so that somebody there could get a hold of me and tell me what was going on. And I tell you, if you don't do a lot of self-care, it can be very overwhelming to the point of burnout, because you want to do so much to create solutions for them. And a lot of times your hands are just tied with the monster that the state can be. So I think it was, for me, being able to find outlets for their stories and people to share their stories with, like TAVP, who obviously cared very deeply about their stories and could at least archive them, and I like to say shelter them for, as our government continues to try to whitewash and change the narratives of the people that it oppresses. There is one place that I know that their stories will be safe. I also, put their stories on paper, published them. That was another way for me to be able to make sure that it was something permanent, that it was written down, just to find ways to make their stories tangible, and unchangeable, and to really kind of keep a lot of self-care, because it can get very overwhelming. That's a lot. And I talked to even a journalist recently that she was like, it's heavy. It's heavy hearing people's stories. So it takes a lot of self-care.
Yeah, I agree. I would also say that I approach it with a deep breath, but really with the spirit, with the empathetic spirit. I think it's important that they know that I'm feeling with them, that I have not separated myself, from being one of them, that it is we and not them, and that because I have not forgotten what it's like, and so I can really empathize with everything, every complaint that is made. I can really empathize with it. I've gotten, food that had a bug in it, or had to drink brown water. There's, not clean water, and all of those struggles. So just really being empathetic, because with the empathetic spirit, then they know that she is for me. She's just not out to just get my story, or to just be a check off the list or whatever. It's something that she needs to do. It's not about trying to make her look good, to say that, oh, she did this or whatever. It's really about how can we help? How can I use my benefit of being out on the outside, on the free world, to help us? Because I'm included and I suffer. I believe that as my loved ones and friends, when they suffer, I'm grieving with them in my heart, even if I'm not there. And I know that it is not a joyous time for anyone incarcerated. So, yeah, that's how I approach it, just to be mindful and being empathetic of the struggle and what it's like.
Yeah, absolutely. In our case, we reached out to a lot of people who had been booked in Hays County on citation eligible offenses, because that's what we do a lot of work around, ending arrests for those offenses. And so I had sent out letters to all of the people who had been booked, and talked about Mano Amiga, our work, what we've accomplished, what our mission is, and then what we're pushing for. And then asked if they would be interested in sharing their story in exchange for a gift card to HEB. And so they had the full discretion to either reach out or not reach out. And so they would call back, and a lot of these communities, they do come from low-income communities, and so that was really helpful for them to receive compensation for their time. And so we would just have a short phone call, and I would emphasize, what we're trying to get done, how their story can impact that fight, And as well as, mentioning that everyone in our organization is either directly or indirectly impacted by the legal system. And I feel like a lot of them were very angry, and they kind of wanted space to vent about their experience, and especially with someone who they know cares and is empathetic and, is there to listen. And also, I think a lot of them really took pride in so Jonah Greta and Jake Rankin are two people who would join us for protests, share the story with journalists, or participate in panels. And Jonah Greta has told us that his friends would tell him, like, "Hey, I saw you on the news," or his family would tell him, "I saw you on the news yesterday evening." And Jake Rankin, he's younger, and he's posted pictures of himself on the internet of him on the panel. And so it's really great to see them take pride in sharing their story and knowing that they're making a difference and pushing for policy change to, keep that from, repeating onto others.
Thank you for sharing that, Sam. As a follow-up, I was hoping that each of you would share a specific story that stuck with you and that continues to guide your activism.
One for me is that I never forget. One day I was in the TV room. Remind me, what is it called? In the day room. Gosh, I was in the day room in the unit. The day room is where the TV is, and there are benches for everyone to sit. And and so I was in the day room, and a friend of mine, an acquaintance of mine, didn't know her very well at all, but she asked me if I could, it was mail call, and she asked me if I could read her mail for her. And I was like, how come? She said she couldn't read. And I said, you can read. I will see her sitting in the day room every day, reading her Bible and things like that. And I told her that, and she said, no, I don't know how to read. I just look at the words and they speak to me. And for me, that was my first time experiencing ever meeting an adult personally. I knew that some people don't know how to read, but I don't think I ever met anyone that did not know how to read that I knew of anyways. And it was real. I was like, wow. But the longer I stayed in prison, of course, I actually met a lot of people who were illiterate. They really did not know how to read. It's a big problem. And so that really stuck to me, that what is being done to help people when they get out. I wonder how many people go into prison not knowing how to read, and what has changed. They do X amount of years and get out and still cannot read. How will they, I think it minimizes their chances of being a productive citizen when they get out. And so they're almost, left with just limited choices when they get out because of that. And then one other experience would be which it brings to mind for me, the lack of resources inside prison. And I'll never forget my first summer on hobby units. Was a sad one, but that summer, it was summer 2011, if I'm not mistaken, but there were 7 heat-related deaths just that summer alone. People that died from heat exhaustion, and we would literally see them leave out of the unit, on a stretcher covered with a white sheet. That was really traumatic for me, seeing that. Several news stations came. At that time, it was cell block, and inside the cell block, it would get up to like 120 something degrees. And at that time, right after all of the deaths happened, up until that point, our windows and our cell block were nailed shut. We couldn't open them. But after that happened, we were able to raise them up. It's bars on them. I don't know why they had to be nailed shut, but we were able to raise them up, which did help a little bit. But just that just made me, I'll never forget, I just had so much fear, and I was like, I may not make it out of here alive, like, and yeah, I even get emotional now just thinking about just the unnecessary deaths that happen inside prison because of something like the heat. We're not even talking about the violence that happens amongst the people that are there, but because of the heat. It's very traumatic to see that happening. So yeah, so I would force myself to drink as much brown water as I could, hoping that if I drank enough of it, I wouldn't die. And just recently, actually last year, I noticed a lot of people on my unit at that time were having something called H. pylori. Come to find out, it's something that you can have for many years. And lo and behold, I started having a lot of intestinal issues last year, stomach issues, and me being as anal as I am about my health, one test after another. And last year, I was told I had H. pylori. Luckily, there were, they gave me a series of antibiotics to get rid of it and retested, and it was negative. But I already knew that, wow, I've had this all this time, and I got it from prison. I just know I did. So, yeah.
Thank you, Lavina. That is
Yeah.
intense. Thank you for sharing that. Jennifer and Sam, did you want to share a story that particularly keeps you going in this work?
Of course. And I just want to reaffirm what Lavina has said about H.P. Pylori, is that every woman that came from Hobby to Mountain View, when she would go to medical, and I can feel the blood rushing to my ears right now, they had H.P. Pylori from contaminated water. And the conditions of confinement and the many stories, like Lavina shared about the heat, about H.P. Pylori, it drives me. It drives me to do the work that I do. And the story that pushes me forward, there's so many, but I recently wrote a piece for the Texas Observer, and it was called Invisible Scars. And it's really hard to articulate to people who have never been to prison and who hear the narrative from men, which their story is valid and true, right? But our stories are different, and the type of psychological violence that we had to endure. On the outside, people may not understand, oh, well, so they were kind of mean to you sometimes, or they said hurtful things. Yeah, but you don't understand that all day, every day, suppressively so, the being degraded and humiliated to either provoke you to act out, or you've got to put a smile on your face and participate in your own degradation. That's how I always felt, that it was just this oppressive psychological violence all the time. And in that piece that I wrote, I told a story about my friend Latrice. Her name has been changed, but she was very excited to see her children, and she hadn't seen them in a long time. And her mother finally was able to get the money together to bring all 5 of her children. And I was seeing my parents. They weren't able to come often. They were elderly, and it's a 4-hour trip all the way from East Texas. So it was, I think most of us here understand the importance of visitation, especially seeing our parents and our kids. And, as soon as we walked into visitation, I don't know if y'all remember, and I see someone's comment here saying we always had to apologize. We were always apologizing for things that weren't our fault. But we always looked to see what officer was working visitation because we knew that was extremely important on how well our visit would go. And there was an officer that was particularly mean and verbally abusive. And the moment we walked into visitation, it was just relentless, psychological and emotional and verbal abuse. There's just no way around that. And, for the most part, we were used to that on a day-to-day basis. But when our family's subjected to it, and you have to sit there, while this lady is screaming at my friend's children in front of her, and everybody in the room is just sitting there, and we just have to take it because she'll, cancel our visit, or she'll take something out on our children or our parents in visitation, because we've seen that happen. And I got a letter from a friend shortly after I got out, and she had shared how she was verbally abused in front of a line of women going to laundry. She was on her way to work, and she picked a small flower. And the male staff member, I believe it was the assistant warden, screamed and berated and threatened her, in front of the rest of the women, so that she had to beg him and cry to please don't write me up, because we also know that women are disproportionately disciplined different than men. There's data on that. And those things, that psychological oppression that they put us under, it drives me. I just can't even explain how deeply personal that is for me. To all those years not be able to say anything for myself or the people I love. And so now that I'm free and I'm off paper, I get to say any damn thing I want to, and I'm going to share those stories, and I'm going to continue doing that in a way that articulates it so that society understands the violence that's done to women in a way that is much different than men, that is just as valid and just as damaging. So definitely my friend's story of how badly she was humiliated in front of her kids by someone who just could abuse authority just because she wanted to. It fires me up quite a bit every day when I think of it.
Thank you, Jennifer. And I also want to just remind the audience that Jennifer's article in The Observer, that's the Texas Observer, and it's titled Invisible Scars. And it is a beautiful piece. It is painful to read, but it is necessary. Sam, did you want to add anything about stories that keep you going?
Yeah, first of all, I just want to thank you both so much for sharing those very powerful stories. Yeah, so the first time that I participated in advocating for cite and release with Mano Amiga, I was, so we were pushing for the cite and release ordinance, which would end immediate arrest for things like possession of marijuana and other low-level offenses. And I thought about, I'm from Laredo, and so I went to my school district was LISD, Laredo Independent School District, and our superintendent was a gentleman named Marcus Nelson, who died a few years ago, and he was just the most incredible superintendent I've ever known. I went to there's two school districts in Laredo. There's United ISD and Laredo ISD. Laredo ISD is the one it's like a circle. It's like Laredo ISD, and then United ISD has all this room to grow. So Laredo ISD, the inner, was the more low-income school district. And despite having significantly less opportunities and resources, I was still really proud to be in my school district because our superintendent was just so awesome. He was so fun. He knew so many of us by name. He would go to all of the extracurricular activities, all the events, and every year he would have he would make a music video where he would sing and rap some popular song, the song of the year, and make the lyrics about school. And we would come out of the music videos. They would choreograph it, and all the students across the district would come out. So that's just to speak to how incredible he was and how invested he was in the students. A couple years after I graduated high school, he was stopped and he was arrested for possession of marijuana in Harris County. and he was forced to resign from his position as a superintendent, which was so heartbreaking because he was incredible, and to see his entire career and life be so needlessly destabilized over just a small amount of marijuana was just so heartbreaking to watch. And so I shared his story before council in advocating for this policy. And I actually, it was my first time talking about it publicly. And because it was so heartbreaking, I actually broke down and I started crying and couldn't finish my speech. I went back 2 weeks later to finish it at the next council meeting. But his story and the way that his life is just so needlessly not just disrupted, but destabilized over this incident is one story that immediately comes to mind. Another is that of who I already mentioned, Joe Negrete. He's just such an amazing person. He was also arrested for possession of marijuana at the beginning of the pandemic. He comes from a low-income background, and he it was around March at the beginning of the pandemic, and he was laid off due to the pandemic, so he was doing a lot of contract work, and I think he was painting houses. So he had just finished up a job and had like a $400 paycheck, and he told us he was really excited to use that paycheck to invest in more equipment and do even more houses more efficiently. But instead of being able to do that, that whole paycheck really went towards his case, and his car was impounded, so he had to pay for that. He also talked all the times that we've met him. He always has his little Chihuahua Ozzy with him, and so Ozzy was with him that evening, and Ozzy was taken to the dog pound, and so he said, it kind of feels like we were both arrested that night. So he just has an incredibly powerful story, and the first time that we met him was at one of our protests for Cite and Divert, and he brought his entire family with him. He brought his girlfriend and all their kids, and we had breakfast with all of them. And so he was really excited. He spoke to several journalists and was really eager to use his story to make a change. And so that morning was just a beautiful morning to see his family support him and him take pride in engaging in our advocacy efforts. So I wouldn't say that's a story, but just someone who inspires me would be Joe Negrete.
Thank you, Samantha. So we know, obviously, that stories have power, that they have the power to change social structures, change people's minds, change people's hearts. And so I wanted to ask, sheltering justice predominantly focuses on people who are currently outside of not incarcerated. What do you think it would mean for people who are currently incarcerated to also participate in something like sheltering justice? Oh, I can't hear you, Lavina.
Sorry. Thank you. I was just talking away, but I said, I think that would really shift the mindset of many people that are incarcerated. It's this, I guess, saying that like prison is the land of the forgotten. Because I think so many people, while they're incarcerated, like their loved ones, friends, family, either are unable to continue to support them, not just financially, but I mean, through letters, and just they seem to find it, a challenge, especially once someone is gone for some time. And then oftentimes family members get old and die, and leaving the person, as their family members dwindle, they hear from them less. And so it can kind of feel like, I'm in this bowl that people go to, and, and I'm going to be just forgotten. And so them being able to see the work that is done out here, I think it would bring just so much meaning and can give so much hope. Like, you know what, it's people out there. When I was incarcerated, I had no idea that there were advocates or anyone on the outside trying to change the conditions that I was in. In my mind, I felt like, I broke the law, so this is why I'm here, and nobody in society could care about what I'm going through while I'm in here. I put myself here, and I definitely kind of was really surprised when I started doing, working as an advocate, to learn how many different agencies and just organizations and how many different people are really, really trying to better the conditions, change the conditions, and abolish slavery, and, that are really putting in work and hours for people incarcerated. I had no idea. And I know that there's a lot of people that are incarcerated right now who, like me, they didn't know. They just, know that they're there, and the people in the free world are there and doing their life, and that they probably don't even know that they're being thought of in that way, to where people would take out hours of their time to, try to put together, organize things, and, to try to make things, just to fight for their human rights. Really, this is a big problem, just basic human rights that shouldn't, have to be such a fight. But because the way the system is the way it is, it's a fight, unfortunately. So I think it would just really could give somebody hope, motivation, and just, just that feeling of, I'm somebody that somebody cares about. That matters. That can improve your mental health, just to know that somebody cares about me. Think about all the people that are suicidal. They in prison, anyways. A lot of times, people feel like, if I was dead, who would no one would miss me. It wouldn't matter, And yeah, so just to know that they do matter to somebody, a lot of people, they matter. You matter. So.
Thank you, Lavina. I love that you said that, because I mean, that is so true. Like the whole time that I was locked up, and many people watching this can attest to the same thing. Nobody cares about us. Like I had no idea that there were this many organizations. And I tell the girls on the inside when they tell me, nobody cares, and the things that go on here, the horrendous things that goes on here, nobody knows and nobody cares. And I'm like, I know that this is, you kind of don't believe me, but I hope that you trust me that I have never seen this type of movement towards criminal justice reform ever. In the 19 years that I've been in the system, I've never seen anything like it. So please know that there are people out here who care very much that you're in ankle deep sewage, that care that you're drinking contaminated water, and they don't care what you did to be there. Believe it or not, there are people that care about you as a human, no matter the mistakes that you've made. And I think, like Lavina said, it's about giving them hope and connection, right? So society puts us away and tells us, you can't belong out here because of this thing you did. So come back out rehabilitated. But you're in there, and your society and your culture acts like they don't care about you. I don't care if you die of the pandemic. I don't care if you're in ankle deep sewage. So what type of connection or ties can we make with a community that made it very clear that they didn't care if we lived or died? And I try to explain that in the community when I do my advocacy work, is like, you want people to come back out and feel a part of the community and to do the right things. But isn't it kind of human nature to kind of resist that if this society didn't care what happened to me? So why should I come out here and do the things that society wants me to do now? And I hear that a lot from the women and men that are locked up. And I hope to see this very thing happen, to where we do collect the stories of incarcerated men and women, and not just on paper, but hopefully in person, and very much the same type of interviews that we've all had. Because like Lavina said, it gives hope and it gives empowerment. A lot of times women, they're a little bit different than men in the sense that they don't always speak up. We take a lot, and we don't do work stoppages and, big riots. And we live in that oppression, that psychological oppression of fear of not seeing our children, of not being able to use the phone, the simple things that, I know men care about, but it's just different. That women just don't, I don't want to use the word rebel, but they don't typically speak up a whole lot because of that fear, and that oppression, that psychological oppression. But I was really impressed and proud of the women that I know during the pandemic, who very much told me, I don't care if you use my name in that article that you're going to write. I don't care. Tell them how to spell it. Run it CC with this sentence. You know what I mean? They were fired up. And when those articles came out and they could see at least their first name in it, they were like, that's me. And I did that. Like, the empowerment that gave those women, just that little act of defiance, of honesty, of standing up for their rights and themselves, it just did something that nothing else can do, to help them be whole. And I think that's what this project could do for the people on the inside, is let them know that there are people that care, and it will empower the women, especially because they just don't stand up for themselves in the same way that men do. This could give them an outlet for that would just be deeply impactful.
So we have about 8.5 minutes left. And in that time, I was hoping that you could share, one, what participating in sheltering justice meant to you personally, and then what you hope the outcome of sheltering justice as a whole is. What, in a perfect world, what would sheltering justice do?
Can you say the first part of that question again?
Sure. What did participating in sheltering justice mean to you personally? And then in your perfect world, what would that project itself do?
Mm-hmm. For me personally, I would say it's really given me an opportunity that I didn't have before, and an opportunity to really share my truth about the impact of incarceration, and especially during this pandemic, with the interview with my loved one that's inside. And I'm looking forward to more opportunities like that, to be a part of bringing awareness to something that's important to me. And in a perfect world, sheltering justice, TAVP, it would be a household name nationwide. Everybody would know about it. Everybody would be able to know, will be familiar with what's in the archives, and would be able to really use this. It'll be used in courts, and just that, it could be a referral, for judges, and just it can just really be something that is really monumental in bringing about true change, and that we all want to see. And it could be a great opportunity to save so many lives, and to really just to change what criminal, to redefine, the justice system. I think it's a excellent platform, with an excellent starting point for things that need to be addressed.
For me personally, it was a defining moment in kind of, when I got out, I saw that there were organizations that cared, and that these issues mattered. But this was the first space where I felt like it really mattered. Like, I don't, like, in a way that was just deeply human. Just the care and the concern in how I told my story, and making sure that it was used and preserved in a way that I felt comfortable and that it represented exactly what I meant for it to. That was powerful, because you don't always get that at other organizations or journalists. Sometimes it's very much used for their purpose. And I feel like TAVP's purpose is my purpose, if that makes sense. And what I hope for the future is that, very much what Lavina said, like, this will be a place of reference. And there is at least, and I always say this, that we know that there's at least one place where our stories are sheltered, protected, and they are not in danger of being whitewashed and changed. For so long in prison, we had to spout the narrative like a hostage, with our captors standing there. We had to say, oh, they're great to us, and oh, because we wanted to keep our job and our visits and all this stuff. But now our narratives are our own. And I'm really excited that there is a place where that is safe. And as people continue to access the archive, the issues become real, they become personal, and that's how you change culture, is through story and narrative. So that's my hope.
Yeah, I think you both said it so beautifully. I feel like it meant so much to me to have, to be able to talk about my dad and his friends and their experiences to people who genuinely care. And that was just it was a really cool experience. And also, like I said earlier, being able to tell those stories my way and not, literally word for word my way, and with no, time limit. There was one time I was, during one of our protests for Cite and Divert, I had an interview with a journalist, and it was probably my proudest interview up to that date, in advocating for Cite and Divert. I had really rehearsed my talking points, and I thought that I did really good. And then towards the end of it, she asked me if there was anyone in my life who would benefit from this program. And I said, and it kind of caught me off guard. I wasn't really prepared for a question like that. I was like kind of focused on like just the policy. And so I was like, yeah, my dad, he was in and out of the legal system my whole life. And I talked about that and how, especially with COVID, he's older. He suffered 3 heart attacks last year. And so I really worry about him getting COVID. And then when we watched the story later, that's all she included, just like those snippets where I was kind of caught off guard talking about my dad. And it just wasn't what I was expecting at all. And my mom at the time, that was the first time that I really talked about my dad publicly. And so they're divorced, but she was really upset about that, because I don't think she understands how powerful that story can be and how it's not something to be ashamed about. And so she was kind of upset with me for talking about my dad. And so talking about it with Texas After Violence was just a completely different experience. And, I wasn't necessarily caught off guard. I was able to tell it my way and in detail. And I think that Lavina said it so beautifully, and what I hope Shelter and Justice will lead to in the future, enacting real systemic change and being a point of reference in the future. I think that would be just incredible.
So I am trying to determine if we are okay. Okay. For a second there, I thought we had another 30 minutes, but as it turns out, we don't. The Eventbrite said 7:30, but we're actually on for an hour. So thank you so much for sharing this space with me, Jennifer, Lavina, and Samantha. Your stories are amazing and powerful and true and real, and I'm just so grateful to be able to hear them and to share this space with you. And so I do want to thank you to everyone who is watching right now for joining us tonight. This was recorded and will be available on the TAVP website and social media. So if you missed anything, you can always go back and rewatch. And while you are doing that, you can also check out more work from TABP on texasafterviolence.org. Again, thank you so much for taking the time to share this time with us, and have a good night.